Are you starting to get it yet? Everything is based around keyframes, so let's dive into the third composition to get some practice. Open 03 Animating the Logo. This is a slightly simpler version of what you saw at the very beginning. I've brought in the Illustrator file as a composition so you have access to all of the layers, and I've added an image of a texture for the background. Now I'm going to go through each layer and animate them onto the screen independently. If you feel confident, you can stop this video and try it yourself. However, let me show you three things first. Layer name versus source name. When you bring an asset into the timeline, you don't have to keep the same name. You can select any layer and press return on the keyboard to change its name. This only changes the name in the timeline. It won't change anything in the project window or on your hard drive. To see the original name, you click the word layer name at the top of the timeline and see how it changes to source name. This is handy if you can't remember where a layer came from, but most of the time leave it on layer name. Naming layers is super important because the timelines can get very complicated with many layers. Naming layers in After Effects is just as important as naming them in Photoshop, and I know you always name your layers in Photoshop, right? Another important point, layer duration. By default, your layers in your timeline last for the entire composition, but they don't have to. If I click and drag on the layers bar in the timeline, you'll see I can move it around. This bar determines when the layer is visible. When I move the layer to later in the timeline, notice how it disappears until the time indicator hits that layer. I can also click and drag on the ends of the layer bar to shorten the duration. This is handy when you're trying to time, when the layers appear. You'll usually use a strap property to animate a layer onto the screen, but if I jump back to the first comp, you can see how I moved the star layers in the timeline so I could see when I wanted them to appear. Okay, let's go back to the third composition. Finally, before we dive into keyframes, the anchor point. We haven't talked much about the anchor point of a layer, so let's do so now. If I change the rotation of one of the wings, you'll see that it's rotating around the center of the wing. I think it would be cool to have the wings rotate out from behind the main circle. To make that work, I need to take the anchor point tool from the toolbar. Well, technically it's called the pan behind tool, but let's just call it the anchor point tool for now. With the anchor point tool, I can click and drag on the anchor point to move it. If I move it to the center of the main circle, you'll see it'll rotate around that point and it looks like it's rotating around the circle. If I move the anchor point to the wing to the bottom of the circle, it'll give me the motion I'm looking for. While rotation is the easiest to demonstrate, the anchor point will affect other strap properties such as scale and position. So there are two rules when you're learning about the anchor point tool. First, always change the anchor point before you create keyframes. If you make a keyframe on a property and then change the anchor point, it can cause you some problems. Second, don't forget to change your tool back to the selection tool. You might not notice that you're in the anchor point tool or pan behind tool, and it can get frustrating when you're trying to move a layer and it doesn't work. Okay. For the rest of this video, I'm going to animate each layer. You can follow along, skip through the video to see what I do, and then try it on your own, or just go for it on your own and have fun.